No one helped us, my daughter-in-law said into the microphone while a ballroom full of wealthy strangers applauded the life I had spent 32 years paying for. I kept smiling anyway. The crystal chandeliers above the stage cast soft golden light across the charity gala, making everything look polished and expensive. Women in designer gowns drifted between white linen tables carrying champagne flutes, and men in tailored suits laughed loudly beside towering floral arrangements that probably cost more than my first month's rent back in 1979. Across the room, giant screens displayed glossy photos of my son Brandon and his wife Vanessa standing beside luxury cars, beachfront resorts, and magazine covers with headlines calling them America's self-made success story. Self-made. That phrase echoed in my head while I sat alone at table 14 with my untouched salmon dinner growing cold in front of me. Vanessa stood confidently at the center of the stage in a silver evening gown, one hand resting lightly against Brandon's arm while cameras flashed around them. Everything we built, she continued smoothly, came from hard work, sacrifice, and believing in ourselves when nobody else did. The audience applauded again. Brandon smiled proudly beside her. And suddenly I could not hear the applause anymore. All I could hear was the sound of the old diner grill hissing at 5 o'clock every morning while I worked double shifts after my husband died. I remembered standing on swollen feet for 14 hours straight pouring coffee for truck drivers so Brandon could stay in business school another semester. I remembered skipping meals to make tuition payments on time. I remembered signing the second mortgage papers with trembling hands because Brandon had called me crying one winter night saying his startup was collapsing and payroll was due by Friday morning. Nobody else did. Vanessa's voice sharpened slightly with practiced emotion. People always ask us what our secret was. Honestly, we just refused to quit. More applause. More smiling. Brandon leaned down and kissed her cheek while the room practically melted around them. I reached slowly into my purse and touched the worn envelope I had carried with me tonight without fully understanding why. Inside were copies of canceled checks, loan transfers, mortgage extensions, and a faded tuition receipt from Northwestern Business School dated September 1998. Proof. Not that anyone in that ballroom cared about proof. They cared about the story. And Vanessa had become very good at telling one. A young waiter stopped beside my chair and asked softly if I wanted more sparkling water. I thanked him with a smile because he was probably the only person in the room who still looked at me like a human being, instead of a decorative old relative seated quietly in the background. On stage, Vanessa laughed gracefully while a local news reporter asked how it felt to achieve success without family money or outside help. Brandon hesitated for barely half a second before answering. We built everything from scratch. The room erupted again. And that was the moment something inside me finally went still. Not broken. Not angry. Just still. Because for the first time I realized they had not forgotten what I sacrificed for them. They had simply decided my part of the story no longer fit the brand they were selling. I left the gala just after 10:30 that night. Nobody noticed. The valet brought my old Buick around while luxury cars lined the circular driveway outside the hotel entrance, their polished surfaces reflecting the city lights like mirrors. A young couple stepped past me laughing as they climbed into a black Bentley, and for a moment I saw Brandon and Vanessa in them. Beautiful clothes. Easy confidence. The kind of people who never had to check their bank balance before buying groceries. I drove home slowly through downtown Chicago with both hands tight around the steering wheel. The radio played softly, but I barely heard it. My mind kept replaying Brandon's voice. We built everything from scratch. By the time I reached my little brick house on Maplewood Avenue, the neighborhood was quiet. Porch lights glowed warmly against trimmed lawns, and somewhere down the street a dog barked once before silence settled again. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside the same house I bought in 1987 after saving tips in a coffee tin for nearly 6 years. The kitchen still smelled faintly like cinnamon because I had baked banana bread that morning before the gala. The ordinary scent nearly made me cry more than the speech had. I slipped off my shoes and stood quietly beside the counter for a long time, staring at the old refrigerator covered in faded magnets and handwritten grocery lists. This house had never been beautiful. The cabinets were outdated, and the hardwood floors creaked during winter, but every inch of it had been earned honestly. Nothing here came from investors or magazine interviews. I walked into the hallway and paused beside the framed photograph hanging near the stairs. Brandon was 19 in that picture, standing outside our diner in his Northwestern sweatshirt with one arm around my shoulders. His smile back then looked open, uncomplicated. I remembered taking that photo the day he received his acceptance letter. We celebrated afterward with grilled cheese sandwiches because neither of us could afford steak dinners or champagne. He hugged me so tightly that afternoon. "I am going to make you proud someday, Mom," he had said. I believed him with all my heart. Back then, he still called me every night from college. Sometimes he would fall asleep on the phone while studying economics textbooks because he was exhausted from working part-time at the campus bookstore. I used to mail him care packages twice a month filled with homemade cookies, socks, cold medicine, and $20 bills I could barely spare. When tuition increased during his junior year, I quietly started taking overnight shifts at the diner on weekends. Most mornings I worked from 5 o'clock until nearly midnight. My feet burned constantly. There were nights I sat alone in the supply closet rubbing arthritis cream into my hands before forcing myself back onto the floor with another smile for customers. But I never regretted it. Not once. Brandon had dreams bigger than that diner. Bigger than our neighborhood. Bigger than the life his father and I had struggled through before Richard passed away from a heart attack at 52. I wanted Brandon to escape. All of it. The debt. The exhaustion. The fear of unpaid bills sitting unopened on the kitchen table. I walked slowly into the living room and lowered myself into my recliner beside the lamp Richard bought me 20 years ago at a garage sale for $15. The envelope from my purse rested heavily in my lap now. I opened it carefully and spread the papers across the coffee table one by one. Tuition receipts. Wire transfers. Mortgage documents. Small pieces of a life nobody mentioned anymore. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. And sitting there alone in the quiet house I had fought to keep for decades, I started wondering exactly when my sacrifices had stopped being part of Brandon's story and started becoming something he needed to hide. 3 days after the gala, Vanessa uploaded a video titled, "How We Built Wealth Without Family Money." By noon it already had nearly 200,000 views. I watched it alone at my kitchen table, while reheating leftover soup in the microwave. Vanessa sat in a cream-colored armchair inside the enormous living room Brandon had bought 5 years earlier, speaking calmly into the camera with the polished confidence of someone who had repeated the same story so many times she no longer questioned it herself. "People assume successful couples had help," she said with a soft laugh. "But honestly, we started with nothing except discipline and ambition." Brandon sat beside her nodding supportively, while morning sunlight poured through windows taller than my old diner's front entrance. Behind them sat a white marble fireplace decorated with expensive art and oversized coffee table books about entrepreneurship. Everything looked curated, perfect, untouched by struggle. I stared at the screen while steam from my soup fogged my reading glasses. Started with nothing. I remembered the first apartment Brandon rented after college. The ceiling leaked every time it rained, and the radiator barely worked during winter. I had driven 2 hours through a snowstorm one January morning, because Brandon called saying his electricity might be shut off before payday. I brought groceries, blankets, and $400, hidden inside an envelope because I did not want him to feel ashamed accepting it. He cried when I handed it to him back then. "I will pay you back," he promised. I told him not to worry about it. Parents are not supposed to keep score. At least that was what I believed then. On the video, Vanessa continued smiling warmly at the camera. We never relied on handouts. Everything came from sacrifice. I almost laughed hearing that word. Sacrifice. She said it like it belonged to them. Like sacrifice was skipping vacations or waking up early for conference calls. Not standing 12 hours in orthopedic shoes while your back spasmed behind a greasy diner counter, because your son needed another semester of tuition money. Not eating canned soup for weeks so you could cover someone else's rent. Not signing away your retirement savings because your child sounded terrified over the phone. I muted the television and leaned back slowly in my chair. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree in my yard had already started turning red for autumn. Richard planted that tree when Brandon was 10 years old. I remembered Brandon helping dig the hole with a plastic toy shovel while insisting he was strong enough to do real work. He used to worship his father. Used to say thank you for everything. Somewhere along the way gratitude became embarrassment. The phone buzzed quietly beside my plate. A text message from Vanessa appeared on the screen. Thank you again for coming to the gala. Everyone said you looked adorable. Adorable. I read the word 3 times. Not elegant. Not kind. Not supportive. Adorable. Like an old woman smiling politely in the background of their success story. A prop. I set the phone face down without replying. Then I noticed another notification underneath her message. Brandon had tagged me in a social media post from the gala. I opened it slowly. There we were standing together beneath the ballroom lights. Brandon in his tuxedo. Me smiling faintly beside him in my navy dress. The caption read, "Grateful my mom got to witness how far we have come." Witness. Not helped build. Not sacrificed for. Just witnessed. As if I had been sitting quietly in the audience of Brandon's life instead of carrying half the weight of it on my shoulders for over 40 years. I stared at the photograph for a long time before finally locking my phone and whispering something into the empty kitchen I had never allowed myself to say before. You are rewriting me. The following Saturday, Brandon invited me to dinner at their house in Lake Forest. He sounded unusually cheerful on the phone, almost rehearsed, like someone trying to smooth over tension without directly acknowledging it existed. "Vanessa is making short ribs," he said warmly. "We have not seen you properly since the gala." I agreed to come because refusing would only create questions I was not ready to answer yet. Their house sat behind tall iron gates at the end of a private street lined with enormous maple trees and perfectly trimmed hedges. The first time Brandon brought me there 5 years ago, I remember standing frozen in the driveway staring at the stone exterior and floor-to-ceiling windows while he smiled proudly beside me. "Can you believe this is ours?" he asked. At the time, I had almost cried from happiness for him. Now walking through those same front doors, I noticed different things. The silence. The museum-like perfection. The family photographs carefully arranged along the hallway walls. Brandon and Vanessa in Italy. Brandon and Vanessa in Aspen. Brandon and Vanessa on a yacht somewhere off the California coast. There was only one picture of me in the entire downstairs area. It sat on a shelf near the laundry room beside a decorative candle, not framed in silver like the others. Just a small photo tucked partly behind a plant. During dinner, Vanessa spoke enthusiastically about a new magazine feature they had coming out next month. "It is about modern entrepreneurs," she explained while pouring sparkling water into crystal glasses. "The journalist loved our story because it feels aspirational." Aspirational. Another polished word. Brandon nodded while cutting his meat carefully. "People connect with authenticity now," he added. "Especially stories about building success without privilege." I looked down at my plate for a moment. The dining room glowed softly beneath an expensive chandelier while jazz music drifted quietly from hidden speakers in the ceiling. Everything felt curated for appearance, even the conversations. Vanessa smiled at me sweetly from across the table. "People your generation probably did not think much about branding, but today perception matters almost as much as business itself." Your generation. I took a slow sip of water before answering. I suppose some people can afford to care about perception more than survival. For the first time that evening, silence settled over the table. Brandon shifted slightly in his chair. Vanessa gave a small laugh like she had not fully understood the comment. Then she smoothly changed the subject to a charity event they were planning in November. Halfway through dinner, a young couple arrived unexpectedly. One of Brandon's investors and his wife. Vanessa lit up immediately, becoming brighter and more animated the way she always did around wealthy people. While dessert was served, the investor complimented Brandon warmly. "Your story is impressive," he said. "Building everything yourselves from nothing takes real grit." I saw Brandon glance toward me for barely a second before smiling politely. "It was definitely not easy," he replied. And there it was again. That tiny hesitation. That flicker of awareness before the lie settled comfortably into place. The investor's wife turned toward me kindly. "You must be proud watching all this happen." I folded my napkin slowly into my lap. I remember when Brandon's first office had water stains on the ceiling and folding chairs from a church basement, I said calmly. Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Those early years were rough," she interrupted quickly. "But we figured it out ourselves eventually." Ourselves. The word landed gently on the table like a polished knife. I looked at Brandon, then truly looked at him, waiting for something. A correction. Thank you. Anything. But he only lowered his eyes toward his wine glass and stayed silent while Vanessa continued telling their beautiful story to the people who wanted so badly to believe it. 2 days after the dinner in Lake Forest, I drove to the old storage unit behind the diner I sold 7 years earlier. The building sat on the edge of an industrial block near the river, squeezed between an auto repair shop and a warehouse with faded blue paint peeling from the walls. Rain clouds hung low over the city that morning, and the wind carried the sharp smell of wet pavement and motor oil through the parking lot. I had not visited the storage unit in nearly 3 years. The metal roll-up door groaned loudly when I unlocked it, as if the place itself resented being disturbed after so much silence. Inside, dust floated through narrow strips of gray light. Old cardboard boxes lined the walls beside stacks of diner menus, rusted coffee machines, and broken stools I once swore I would repair someday. The air smelled like paper, grease, and time. I stood there quietly for a moment with my coat wrapped tightly around me, suddenly overwhelmed by the strange feeling that my real life had been packed away in this room while Brandon and Vanessa built a shinier version somewhere else. Near the back corner sat a plastic container labeled Financials. I carried it carefully onto an old folding table and opened the lid. Inside were folders organized in my own handwriting. Mortgage papers, tax returns, insurance files, tuition receipts. Every sacrifice documented neatly in fading ink. I pulled out a thick envelope marked 2011 Emergency Transfer. My stomach tightened instantly because I remembered that year better than I wanted to. Brandon's startup had been barely 11 months old when his biggest client backed out unexpectedly. He called me after midnight sounding terrified. "Mom, if payroll bounces, the company is dead," he whispered. I could still hear the panic in his breathing even now. Back then I had already been considering retirement because my arthritis was getting worse. Some mornings my fingers locked painfully around the coffee pots while customers pretended not to notice. But none of that mattered when Brandon called. The next morning I liquidated nearly $80,000 from my retirement account and wired it directly into his business account before noon. I found the confirmation slip still folded. Inside the envelope, $80,412. Everything I had spent 30 years saving after Richard died. I sat down slowly on the folding chair, staring at the number while rain tapped steadily against the storage unit roof overhead. That money had paid salaries, rent, equipment leases. It had kept Brandon's dream alive long enough for investors to notice him. Without it, there would have been no magazine covers, no charity galas, no speeches about building success from nothing. I kept searching through the boxes for nearly 2 hours. The deeper I looked, the more pieces of myself I found buried there. Pawn shop receipts from the year Brandon studied abroad in London. Overdue utility notices from winters when I prioritized his tuition over heating bills. A faded diner ledger where I had handwritten every extra shift I worked after his father died. Evidence everywhere. Quiet evidence. The kind nobody applauds because struggle is only inspirational after someone becomes rich enough to package it attractively. As I placed the documents back into their folders, something else caught my attention near the bottom of the box. A framed photograph wrapped carefully in newspaper. I pulled it out slowly. It was Brandon at 26 standing beside me on the day he opened his first tiny office downtown. We were both laughing at something outside the frame. Behind us sat mismatched furniture, second-hand computers, and cheap blinds hanging crooked in the windows. Brandon had his arm around my shoulders in the picture, proud and grateful and exhausted all at once. Written across the bottom in black marker were the words, "Could not have done this without Mom." I stared at that sentence for a very long time while the rain continued falling outside. Then quietly, almost without realizing it, I whispered into the empty storage unit, "So when exactly did that become something you needed to erase?" The next week, Vanessa appeared on a nationally streamed business podcast called Rising Women. I only knew because my neighbor Carol mentioned it while handing me my mail over the fence Tuesday morning. "Your daughter-in-law is everywhere lately," she said, with an impressed smile. I saw her online talking about entrepreneurship. I thanked her politely and waited until evening to watch the interview alone. By 7 o'clock, rain pressed softly against the windows again, while the television filled my living room with bright studio lights and cheerful music. Vanessa sat confidently across from the host in a fitted cream blazer, her legs crossed neatly, every movement controlled and elegant. Brandon joined later through video call from New York, smiling from some luxury hotel suite with skyline views behind him. They looked less like real people now and more like a polished campaign. The host leaned forward eagerly. "People love your story because it feels so authentic," she said. "No wealthy parents. No trust funds. Just determination." Vanessa laughed softly. "Exactly. We built our life ourselves. Nobody handed us anything." I felt something shift inside me hearing those words spoken so casually this time. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Something colder. Clearer. The interview continued while they described sleepless nights, startup pressure, and business risks as though struggle had belonged exclusively to them. Brandon talked about resilience. Vanessa talked about vision. Neither one mentioned the diner. Or Richard. Or the retirement account I emptied so their company could survive long enough to become profitable. At one point, the host smiled warmly and asked, "What keeps you grounded after all this success?" Vanessa answered immediately, "Remembering where we came from." I looked around my small living room then, at the faded wallpaper near the hallway, the repaired armchair Richard once fixed with wood glue instead of replacing because we could not afford new furniture, the old ceramic cookie jar Brandon painted in elementary school that still sat crookedly on my kitchen counter after 30 years. This was where they came from. Not the penthouse networking events. Not the magazine covers. Not the carefully edited social media clips with soft piano music underneath them. This house. These sacrifices. This ordinary life they now treated like an inconvenient detail. The interview ended with applause and promotional graphics flashing across the screen while Vanessa smiled beside the words, "Self-made success." I turned the television off slowly. The silence afterward felt enormous. For several minutes I sat motionless in the darkened room listening to the refrigerator hum softly in the kitchen. Then, for the first time in weeks, I stood up with purpose instead of confusion. I walked upstairs to the hallway closet and pulled down the large banker boxes I had carried home from the storage unit. One by one, I spread the documents across my dining room table beneath the hanging light fixture. Tax records, mortgage extensions, tuition statements, bank transfers, legal filings, everything arranged carefully into neat stacks. I worked quietly for almost 3 hours while the house remained completely still around me. Around midnight, I found myself holding the framed photograph from Brandon's first office again. Could not have done this without Mom. His handwriting looked younger there. Honest. Before image became more important than truth. I placed the photo gently beside the paperwork and stared at the table for a long time. It looked less like evidence and more like a timeline of invisible labor. Decades of it. I realized then that Brandon and Vanessa believed silence meant consent. They thought because I never demanded credit, I would continue allowing myself to disappear from their story completely. But sitting there beneath the dim dining room light, surrounded by documents they hoped nobody would ever see, I quietly made a decision. I was done helping them pretend they built their empire alone. The following Friday afternoon, I drove downtown to meet Harold Green for coffee. Harold had been the accountant for my diner for nearly 20 years before retiring to Wisconsin, and after finding his old business card in the storage unit, I called him without fully knowing what I planned to say. We met at a quiet cafe near the river where businessmen typed on laptops beneath soft jazz music, and the smell of roasted coffee beans drifted through the air. Harold looked older than I remembered, thinner too, but his eyes were still sharp behind thick glasses. The moment he saw me standing near the entrance, his face softened warmly. "Evelyn Carter," he said, pulling me gently into a hug. "Still carrying the weight of the world on those shoulders?" I smiled faintly and sat across from him beside the window. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Retirement. His grandchildren. The diner building, which had become a fitness studio now. But eventually the conversation settled into silence, and Harold studied my expression carefully before speaking again. "Something is bothering you," he said quietly. I looked down at the coffee cup warming my hands. "Do you remember the emergency transfer I made for Brandon back in 2011? Harold gave a slow nod immediately. "I remember trying to talk you out of it." I stared out the window at pedestrians crossing the rainy street. He tells people now that he built everything himself. Harold leaned back in his chair without surprise. I figured that would happen eventually. His answer hit me harder than I expected. You figured. He folded his hands carefully on the table. Evelyn, people become very protective of successful narratives. Especially when money and status get involved. The cleaner the story sounds, the easier it sells. Even hearing the word made me tired. Harold reached into his leather briefcase and removed a thin folder. When I retired, I kept copies of certain records because I worried you had given away too much trying to save Brandon's company. He slid the folder gently toward me. Inside sat copies of financial statements, transfer confirmations, and one particular document I had completely forgotten existed. A personal guarantee form with my signature agreeing to cover Brandon's business debts if the company failed within 18 months of the transfer. My chest tightened instantly reading it. I remembered signing those papers late at night in Harold's office while Brandon sat beside me exhausted and terrified. I cannot lose this company, Mom, he kept repeating back then. I had signed without hesitation. Harold lowered his voice. Do you know how close they actually came to bankruptcy? I shook my head slowly. 37 days, he said. That transfer kept the doors open long enough for their investors to step in. 37 days. I sat there silently trying to absorb how thin the line truly was between the empire Brandon celebrated now and complete collapse all those years ago. Harold looked at me carefully for a moment before asking the question I had been avoiding myself. What are you planning to do with all this? Outside, rain streaked against the cafe windows while traffic crawled through downtown Chicago beneath gray skies. I thought about Vanessa smiling into cameras, Brandon lowering his eyes every time someone praised their independence. The speeches, the interviews, the way they had slowly transformed my sacrifices into something inconvenient. I do not want revenge, I said finally. Good, Harold replied gently. Because revenge makes people loud. Truth does not have to be loud. We sat quietly after that. Two old people drinking coffee while the city rushed past outside. Before leaving, Harold placed one hand softly over the folder between us. Evelyn, he said carefully, there is a difference between being humble and allowing yourself to disappear. I carried those words with me all the way home. Monday morning arrived cold and bright, with thin October sunlight stretching across my dining room table where the folders still sat exactly as I had left them the night before. I woke before 6, unable to sleep, and made coffee slowly while the house creaked softly around me. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel confused anymore. Sad, yes, but not confused. There is a strange kind of peace that comes when denial finally leaves a room. By 8 o'clock, I had organized everything into 3 large envelopes. One addressed to the editor of Chicago Executive Monthly, the magazine preparing Brandon and Vanessa's feature story. One addressed to the senior partner at Brandon's investment firm. And one addressed personally to Vanessa's podcast producer. Inside each envelope were copies of the same documents. Tuition payments, mortgage records, the emergency transfer, the personal guarantee form, along with a short typed letter that simply read, I believe successful stories should also be truthful ones. No accusations, no dramatic speeches, just facts. I drove to the post office myself instead of using the mailbox outside my house. The woman behind the counter smiled politely while weighing the envelopes. Important documents? She asked casually. I looked down at the stack in my hands. Very old ones, I answered softly. Afterward, I stopped at a grocery store on the way home and bought chicken soup, bananas, and laundry detergent like it was any ordinary Monday. That was the strangest part of all. The world kept moving normally, while something enormous shifted quietly beneath the surface of my life. By Wednesday afternoon, Brandon called me 3 times while I was trimming dead flowers in the backyard. I let the phone ring each time. Then Vanessa called. Then Brandon again. Finally, around 6 o'clock, a text message appeared. Mom, please call me. Something strange is happening. Strange. I almost smiled reading it. 2 hours later, another message arrived from Vanessa. A magazine editor contacted us asking about private family financial matters. Did you speak to someone? I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and continued washing dishes. The water ran hot over my hands while dusk settled outside the windows. Somewhere deep inside me, I expected guilt to arrive. Panic. Regret. But instead I felt calm. Because I had not lied. I had not exaggerated. I had simply stopped protecting a false story that required my own erasure to survive. Thursday morning, I opened my laptop and saw that Brandon's investment firm had quietly removed the phrase self-made from his online biography. By noon, Vanessa's upcoming magazine feature had been postponed indefinitely. Social media comments began appearing beneath her latest interview clips, asking questions about family money and startup financing. Nothing explosive, just enough uncertainty to crack the polished image they had spent years building. That evening, Brandon finally arrived at my front door just after sunset. Through the window beside the entryway, I saw him standing there alone with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He looked exhausted, smaller somehow. I opened the door slowly without speaking. For a moment neither of us moved. The porch light cast soft shadows across his face, and suddenly I could see traces of the young man from the diner photograph again beneath all the success and expensive tailoring. "Mom," he said quietly, "why are people asking questions about our finances?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because eventually the truth gets tired of being hidden. Brandon stared at me silently while cold wind rustled the dry leaves across my front yard. Then his eyes drifted past me toward the dining room table where the remaining folders still sat neatly stacked beneath the hanging light. His expression changed instantly. Not anger yet. Recognition. Because for the first time, he understood I was no longer willing to disappear quietly inside the version of the story they created without me. Brandon stood silently in my doorway for several seconds before finally stepping inside. He looked around the house slowly as though seeing it clearly for the first time in years. The old hardwood floors. The faded curtains above the kitchen sink. The framed photographs lining the hallway walls. This place had once been the center of his entire world. Yet now he moved through it like a visitor in a museum built around someone else's life. I closed the front door quietly behind him and returned to the dining room table where the folders remained stacked in careful rows beneath the hanging light. Brandon stopped across from me, his face pale with exhaustion. "Investors are calling," he said finally. "Magazine editors. Reporters. Vanessa is furious." I pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. "I imagine she is." He stared at the document spread across the table before running one hand over his face. "You could have talked to me first." I looked at him calmly. "I tried talking for years, Brandon. You just stopped hearing me." The room fell silent except for the ticking kitchen clock near the stove. Outside, wind rattled dry leaves against the porch steps. Brandon lowered himself into the chair across from me, and suddenly looked much older than 41. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone struggling to hold together two versions of himself at once. "You do not understand how hard we worked," he said quietly after a moment. "I never said you did not work hard." My voice stayed steady. "But hard work and help are not opposites." He opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Because somewhere beneath all the branding and interviews and polished speeches, he knew I was right. I reached toward the framed photograph resting beside the folders and slid it gently across the table toward him. Brandon picked it up slowly. The moment he saw the handwritten words at the bottom, something in his expression cracked. "I forgot about this picture," he whispered. "No," I said softly. "You forgot what it meant." He stared down at the photograph for a very long time. I watched his eyes move across the image of that tiny office with its folding chairs and crooked blinds. Back before success became a performance. Back when gratitude still came naturally to him. "Vanessa thought the self-made story sounded stronger," he admitted quietly. "People respect independence." I folded my hands carefully in my lap. And what exactly was so shameful about being loved enough to receive help? Brandon looked down immediately. That question seemed to hurt him more than anything else I had said all evening. The truth was, I never wanted public credit for what I sacrificed. I never needed magazine interviews or applause or social media praise. What wounded me was not the lack of recognition. It was the deliberate removal. The quiet rewriting of history until my existence in their success became something inconvenient they edited away. Brandon's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I never meant to erase you. I studied my son across the table and realized something sad then. People rarely notice the exact moment they begin betraying someone. It happens gradually. One polished interview. One uncomfortable omission. One silence left uncorrected. Until eventually the lie feels easier to protect than the truth. I stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen window where darkness pressed softly against the glass. When your father died, I said quietly, I spent years making sure you never felt the fear I felt. I wanted your life to be bigger than survival. Brandon remained silent behind me. And it became bigger, I continued. I am proud of that. But somewhere along the way, success stopped being enough for you. You needed the story to sound cleaner too. Tears filled Brandon's eyes then, though he tried hard to hide them. What happens now? He asked. I looked out at the dark yard where Richard's maple tree swayed gently in the cold October wind. Then I answered with the calm certainty that had finally settled inside me after weeks of grief and clarity. Now, I said softly, you tell the truth when people ask how you got here.